about the struggle towards new succession laws for Christian communities in Middle Eastern countries today. And just to give you a very brief overview of my talk today. So I'm first going to talk a little bit more in general about how countries can be classified in terms of how they organize succession law in Middle Eastern countries with respect to Christian minorities. Then I'm going to zoom in on the Jordanian case and talk a little bit about the Jordanian legal system and how inheritance is organized. Then I asked the question why inheritance is important at all, how it affects Muslim and Christian women, and I argue using the concept of intersectionality that gender and religious affiliation intersect, and therefore most Christian women are more negatively affected by the application of Islamic family law. And then I speak a little bit about the movement for reform in Jordan, which led to a draft law, the first draft succession law issued by all Christian communities in Jordan in 2018, and then I draw some broad conclusions about the organization of succession law of Christian minorities in the Middle East. So we can group Middle Eastern countries, broadly speaking, in three categories. So the first one would be countries in which Islamic inheritance law is applied to the population as a whole, so including Christian and in some cases Jewish minorities. So that would be Jordan and Iraq. Then there are countries in which Christian communities apply their own inheritance laws. Such countries include Iran, Lebanon, and more recently Syria, where in 2006 the Catholic community issued a new law that was approved by Parliament, and then in 2010 legal autonomy in inheritance matters was expanded to include all Christian communities in Syria. And then the third case is a little bit controversial probably, and those are ambiguous countries, so countries in which the legal situation isn't clear, and I would argue that Egypt might be grouped into that category since 2014. Of course, Egypt would normally be in category 1, so in general, Christian communities would apply the Islamic inheritance law, but since Article 3 of the 2014 Constitution was introduced, which basically stipulates that the laws of Christian and Jewish communities are their sources of their personal status legislation, there has been some ambivalence. And the case law, probably the most famous case, is the Huda Nasrallah case from 2019. Huda Nasrallah is an Orthodox Copt, a human rights attorney. Her father had passed away in 2018. She had then, the family court in Helwan had then issued a death certificate and a certificate of heirship. The court divided the inheritance according to Islamic law, which meant that Huda's two brothers received double the share of herself. And then she petitioned the court to issue a new certificate of heirship, basing herself on the Egyptian constitution at Article 3, which I had just mentioned, of 2014, and argued that the court should apply the Coptic Orthodox Law of 1938, which, of course, as you probably know, contains provisions on inheritance. In the end, she won, so the court ruled in her favor and issued a new certificate of heirship that then divided the inheritance according to the Coptic law. So she received equal shares. She and her brothers received equal shares. Yes, but in general, of course, the situation is still that the majority of Christians in Egypt will still apply the Islamic family law, and we will have to see how this constitutional change will influence adjudication and legal developments in the future. So just to zoom in a little bit on the Jordanian legal case, so family and succession law is either applied by church courts or Sharia courts. So the Sharia courts would apply the Islamic family law and then, of course, the Islamic succession law, and the church courts would apply the family law based on their denomination. So Greek Orthodox have a law, the Catholics example, law and so forth. And then they would also, in matters of inheritance, they would apply the Islamic inheritance law. And that is based on two laws, really. So the 2014 law for Christian councils, the Kanun Majalis Atwa al-Masihiyya, which gives Christian communities that are recognized, those are 11 in Jordan, the autonomy to establish their own courts and to apply their own family laws, but it limits this legal autonomy to family matters and explicitly states that with regards to, for example, immovable property, the Islamic national law would be applied. And the other legal source is the Jordanian Civil Code, Article 1086, which also stipulates that the appointment of heirs, the division of the inheritance, and the determination of the shares is done in accordance with Islamic law. And this article was, of course, borrowed from the Egyptian Civil Code. So, inheritance, why does it matter? Of course, as we all know, inheritance is gendered. So, in general, Shiite and Sunni inheritance law upholds the concept of 2 shares for men and 1 share for women of the same degree. But then it's also important to mention that there's a shared experience of Muslim and Christian women when it comes to the practice of inheritance. So Muslim and Christian women face legal discrimination, but they also face discrimination when it comes to practice. So we often think of these communities as distinct, but there's great overlap in how they experience these legal processes. And the most common denominator is probably that Christian women, just as Muslim women, often renounce their inheritance shares in favor of their brothers, mainly, or other main members of the family when it comes to land. So we have, of course, this great study by Annelies Moors on Palestine. We have actually a few other studies on Palestine, mainly based on survey research carried out by the Zayed University that shows that Muslim women often renounce their inheritance share. They tend not to inherit land, and they do so to generate family support and to be on good terms with their brothers. And interviews I've conducted in Amman with Christian women show that this experience is very much shared. So Christian women tend not to inherit land. One woman I interviewed said, my mother owned land in Ashdun. She wanted to give it all to my brothers. My father said to me, your brothers need it more because I married a man who's well off. I did not know what the exact value of the estate was. I was 22 at the time. I did not know what I was giving up. We were not aware of our rights. My brother's wife, she will make olive oil from my father's land. Land is not given to girls. So, I mean, this quote is very rich. It brings up many of the concepts that come up constantly. So the idea that once a woman is married, she belongs to a new family. Her family would not want land to pass into the hands of another family. Her husband would be responsible for financially maintaining her, so therefore she doesn't need the land. Also the same justification for justifying unequal inheritance shares, so men are the financial providers, so this is why they have a greater need for inheriting financial resources. And also the process, very often women do not know what they are giving up. And yes, I'm currently conducting a quantitative survey in Jordan that measures inheritance attitudes and practices of Muslims and Christians, for which 1,400 people will be interviewed. So I hope this will allow me to make claims about how representative these experiences are. So, intersectionality. So what do I mean by that? I would argue that in the case of inheritance, gender and religious affiliation intersect. So while Muslim and Christian women are discriminated against based on the laws that exist and also on legal practice, Christian women are arguably affected more strongly due to 3 main reasons. the interreligious marriage impediments in place, the interreligious inheritance impediments in place, and the content of the family laws of Christian communities themselves. So, as you all know, interreligious marriage impediments allow a Muslim man to marry a Christian or a Jewish woman, but not vice versa. Difference of religion constitutes an impediment to inheritance. So in such a marriage, the Christian spouse would not inherit from her Muslim husband. And of course, vice versa, you could now argue that, well, this is discrimination in both ways. And I have interviewed a rich Christian woman who is married to a Muslim and who, well, in that case, the Muslim husband who is financially less apt than she is would face discrimination because he cannot inherit from her. But in general, men have greater financial resources. So this religious impediment to inheritance affects women arguably more strongly than men. And then the third issue is that Christian women enjoy fewer financial resources according to their own family laws. And that is, for example, best illustrated by the institution of the mahr. So while, of course, the mahr is obligatory according to Islamic law, it is present in the family laws of many Christian communities, but it is optional and it is not an obligation. And in terms of practice, it is not part of the practice. And I actually, in this survey that I'm conducting with these 1,400 people, I had included a question how big the mahr was women had received, and I wanted to ask that question to Christian and Muslim women. And that created such an outcry among the team that is conducting the survey because they were saying, well, that would be very offensive to ask such a question to a Christian woman because this is a Muslim institution and this would seem ignorant. So even though that institution is present in the legal texts of these communities, it is not part of the legal practice. So one woman I interviewed who is married to a Muslim said this: "You're allowed to marry a Muslim. I'm in interreligious marriage. So if I had children, they would not inherit from me because the children of a Muslim man are automatically Muslim. The children who are born from my womb, they don't inherit from you. I feel like they try to make us choose between our children and our religion. It is a way of forcing people to convert. They say they allow interreligious marriage, but they don't have a solution for it. Inheritance creates a grudge." So I think this illustrates the conflict and the potential conflict inheritance rules can create, and that inheritance is, as you all know, in many ways a trigger for conversion and for forcing people to change their religion. So this is Lina Lucke. Lina Lucke is a passionate singer. This is actually a cover from her album, Untitled Chapter. And she is also from one of the richest families in Jordan, the Lucke family. She's Greek Orthodox. Her father passed away a few years ago, and the inheritance was divided according to Islamic law. So her brothers inherited double her share. And that experience triggered her to this feeling of injustice, then made her organize in favor of inheritance law reform in Jordan. So she assembled a reform committee that met at her mansion in Amman that was composed of representatives of different churches and lawyers. And that committee then elaborated a draft law for a draft succession law for all Christian communities in 2018. And I just want to point out a few of the issues that this law raises. So first we can say that it is obvious that the law is influenced by Islamic legal sources, it displays legal borrowing, so especially the committee looked towards other family laws applied by Christian communities, mainly in Lebanon, and it to a limited extent also borrows from international legal concepts. So the Islamic influences are clear, for example, with respect to interreligious inheritance impediments that are adopted. So a Christian can only inherit from a Christian. And the will, the wasiya, is restricted to 1/3 of the estate, just as in Islamic law. But then there are also important differences to Islamic law. So the draft installs formal equality between men and women, so sisters and brothers, mothers and fathers and so forth would inherit equal shares. Representation is introduced, so if a child passes away before the parent, his or her children would inherit in her place, and the adopted child inherits. That is in accordance with the family laws of Christian communities who allow adoption and who also provide for the adopted child to inherit. And interestingly, the draft law also introduces inheritance rights for children born out of wedlock, and this, of course, is in sharp violation with the current Christian family laws, which would not allow a child born out of wedlock to inherit. So, just to be clear, children born out of wedlock are not put on equal footing with children born within the context of a valid marriage, but it is significant, I think, that inheritance rights of children out of wedlock were acknowledged at all. So why is reform challenging? So since 2018, the draft law has not been adopted, and it is unclear what is going to happen. So the first issue is the question of public policy, nizam al-am. So what is being discussed is whether it's possible at all to apply an inheritance law that is a Christian inheritance law in Jordan, or whether this would be considered a violation of public policy. So for example, in Jordan, Christian communities cannot apply the adoption provisions of their individual family laws, as this is seen as in violation of the nizam al-am. So there is discussion about whether it would actually be possible to apply an inheritance law unique to Christians. Then there's also the question of what could the process of reform look like. So who has the authority to codify the law? There are great divisions between the individual churches, so there's great disagreement. There are conflicts between the individual churches, so it's very difficult for them, like in other countries, to agree on anything. And then adding to this is the organization of the family laws of Christian community, which is based on the regional level and we are not dealing with national laws here. So normally these churches are organized according to patriarchates. So for example, with respect to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem is composed of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. So the head of the community is the patriarch based in Jerusalem. So you are advocating across state lines. You need to coordinate with many stakeholders in many different countries. This is not a national affair, and that makes it much more complicated. Then there's also a question of whether the law would be adopted by parliament, whether it would be published in the official gazette. At the moment, the laws that Christians apply with respect to personal status are not published in the official gazette, so there are a lot of uncertainties. There are also questions with regard to the sources. What sources should the law be based on? What is the methodology that should be used? There is simply no precedent of codifying inheritance for Christian communities in Jordan. And then, last but not least, there's of course also opposition to reform. So many church court judges I've interviewed would say that Canaan law does not outline inheritance, and therefore it is not a problem for Christian communities to apply the Islamic law. That's not a violation of Canaan law. And since, as in Islamic law, the husband is the provider of the family, he should receive a bigger share of the inheritance. So there are also cultural arguments that are being used. So there's disagreement about what the law should look like. Yes, so just to conclude, Christian autonomy in inheritance matter is a growing phenomenon. We also have other examples beside the Syrian case. For example, in 2017, the Protestant community in Palestine issued a new law that also contains provisions on inheritance and introduces equal inheritance shares for men and women of the same degree. It's introducing equal inheritance, formal legal equality for men and women according to new laws issued by Christian communities. Of course, also then creates new inequalities, in this case between Muslim and Christian women. In the case of inheritance, gender and religious affiliation intersect, and I would argue succession law reform is therefore just the beginning of addressing
Dörthe, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you've exhausted your 20 minutes, so if
yes,
you can conclude.
I have 2 more points, okay. So I'm going to make them and then the floor is yours.
Okay.
So Christian communities face unique challenges that need to be understood within the context of state law pluralism, and we often think of reform as a majority influencing a minority, but in this case it is possible that there might be possible feedback effects in the other way, in the other directions. So there is concern also within the Muslim community that a possible Christian law that regulates inheritance would then trigger debates about inheritance within the Muslim community. And I end here. Thank you very much.